girl comes back from death with a shocking truth about God. The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon, casting a golden light across the small town. The church, standing at the center of the town square, was the focal point of the gathering. Its old wooden doors, now slightly worn and weathered from years of service, had been flung open wide, welcoming the townspeople inside for what was being called a miraculous event. The news of Anna's return, after being declared dead in a tragic car accident, had spread like wildfire. The preacher, John, had called for a special service to welcome her back, to hear the story of her return and give thanks for the supposed miracle. Inside the church, the rows of pews were packed with the faithful, all eager to witness the moment they had waited for. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, but also something else, an undercurrent of fear. The atmosphere was heavy, as though the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. Anna, barely 14, stood in the center of the church, surrounded by her family, but her gaze was not on them. Her parents, still in a state of shock, had taken their places next to her, but even they could not seem to look at her without a mixture of awe and disbelief. Anna, however, stood tall, her expression strangely calm, almost detached. There was something about her that didn't seem to belong. She looked like the little girl they had lost, but there was something in her eyes, a coldness that seemed unnatural. John, the preacher, stood at the pulpit, his hands raised in greeting as he addressed the congregation. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice booming across the church, "today is a day of celebration. A miracle has occurred, and we are here to witness the grace of God in our midst. Our beloved Anna, whom we mourned as lost, has returned to us. God has answered our prayers, and we are blessed." The congregation responded with murmurs of agreement, some nodding fervently, while others simply watched with wide eyes, unsure of what to make of this sudden, inexplicable event. John gestured toward Anna, his voice filled with reverence. "Anna, my dear, come forward and share with us the story of your time away. Tell us what you have seen. Tell us how God has brought you back." Anna stepped forward, her small frame moving with an eerie stillness. Her eyes scanned the room, but there was no warmth in them, no spark of recognition. She seemed unaffected by the crowd, as if they were nothing more than a distant noise. Her parents exchanged worried glances, but Anna didn't seem to notice. "I don't know how to explain it," Anna began, her voice steady but strangely hollow. "I don't know how I ended up here, back with all of you. One moment I was in the accident, and then everything went dark." The congregation listened intently, the room silent except for the faint creaking of the old wooden pews. Anna paused, as though she were waiting for something, her gaze unwavering as she surveyed the people around her. "God brought me back, right?" A voice called out from the crowd, the woman's voice trembling with a mixture of awe and expectation. "That's why you're here, isn't it? To show us His grace?" Anna's eyes flicked toward the woman, and for a moment, the room seemed to grow colder. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she just stared, her face unreadable. "I don't think it's as simple as that," she said, her voice cutting through the silence with unsettling calm. "I didn't come back because of God's grace. I came back to deliver a message. A warning." The entire church went still. The air seemed to thicken, as if the very space was holding its breath, unsure of how to react. Whispers rippled through the crowd, but Anna stood unmoved. She was no longer the innocent, lost child they had remembered. The girl before them seemed like a stranger, someone who had seen things that could not be unseen. John, trying to regain control of the situation, stepped forward. "Anna," he said gently, "we understand that you may be confused, but this is a time for rejoicing. You've been given a second chance. You've been brought back by God's will. This is a miracle. You don't need to be afraid." Anna shook her head slowly, her eyes narrowing as she spoke, her voice now colder. "God didn't bring me back. He doesn't work like that. He doesn't care." The room fell into a heavy silence. The preacher, still holding on to his belief, stared at her with disbelief. "What do you mean? You're telling me that after everything you've been through, after all the prayers that have been said for you, you don't believe it was God who brought you back?" Anna turned away from him, her gaze falling to the floor as she spoke, her voice quieter now but filled with an unsettling certainty. "I saw the truth. I saw what happens after we die. And it's not what you've been told. It's not what any of you believe." The congregation sat frozen, staring at Anna, unsure whether to believe her or not. Her words hung in the air, like an ominous cloud that threatened to break open at any moment. They had expected a story of comfort, of peace, of redemption. Instead, they were being confronted with a terrifying reality, a reality that threatened to shatter everything they had been taught to believe. The preacher's face flushed with anger, the lines of his features hardening. "What are you saying?" he demanded. "How dare you speak like that? This is blasphemy. You were dead, Anna. You were brought back to life to witness God's power, not to spread lies." But Anna didn't flinch. She looked at him, her expression unwavering, her voice now filled with a cold certainty. "You're wrong. God didn't bring me back. What I saw in the afterlife was nothing like what you've preached to us. It wasn't peace. It wasn't paradise. It was darkness. It was a void." A collective gasp rose from the crowd. The air seemed to thicken, the tension rising to an unbearable level. The preacher, now visibly shaken, stepped back, his words faltering. Anna continued, her tone growing more urgent. "You all believe that God is watching over you, that He is loving and merciful. But He's not. He doesn't care about any of us. He's distant. He's indifferent. We're just pawns in a game." Her words felt like a slap across the face of the congregation. They had come seeking salvation, and instead, they were confronted with the terrifying possibility that their faith had been built on a lie. Anna's truth was a sharp blade that cut through everything they had believed in. As the preacher stumbled back, his hands trembling, Anna stood tall, her eyes scanning the crowd. "The truth isn't easy to accept," she said, her voice steady but cold. "But it's the only truth. And now you will have to face it." The church was frozen in stunned silence. Every eye was fixed on Anna, her words reverberating through the space like a thunderclap. She stood at the center, calm and unyielding, while the rest of the congregation fidgeted, whispering among themselves, their faces pale with shock. The once vibrant warmth of the church was now overshadowed by a chilling coldness, an unsettling stillness that gripped the room. The preacher, John, wiped the sweat from his brow as he tried to regain control, but his words faltered. "Anna, what you're saying is, it's not true. You've been through a trauma, you've seen things that no one should have to see, but you're mistaken. God has brought you back, and He's brought you back to help us, to show us His power." But Anna's gaze never wavered. "No," she said, her voice flat and cold. "You're wrong. I've seen it with my own eyes. God didn't bring me back. He doesn't care about any of you. He doesn't care about anything. He's not a father. He's not a savior. He's a force." The words were like poison to the preacher's soul. The air in the room seemed to thicken, suffocating those who had once held their faith so strongly. This was no longer a place of worship. It had become a battleground for belief and disbelief, and Anna's revelation had thrown everything into chaos. The townspeople were divided, some glancing nervously at each other, unsure of what to think. The room buzzed with unease. Some began to whisper loudly enough for Anna to hear, calling her a liar, accusing her of mocking their faith, but others were silent, too stunned to speak. The fear that Anna had spoken the unspoken truth was too much for them to process. The preacher, now visibly shaken, clenched his fists and took a step forward. His face was red with frustration, his voice cracking under the strain. "You were given a gift, Anna. You were brought back from death to serve a higher purpose, to bring hope to us. And now, you're telling us that it was all a lie? That God is not real? That He's just nothing?" Anna didn't respond immediately. She simply watched him, her face an unreadable mask. There was no pity in her eyes, no sorrow for what she had to say. She wasn't here to comfort them, or to give them what they wanted to hear. She was here to tell them the truth, no matter how much it hurt. "God doesn't care," she said again, her voice calm but steady. "He didn't bring me back to give you hope. He didn't bring me back to save you. I saw the truth. I saw the vast emptiness of existence, the coldness of the universe. You are all just fleeting, insignificant creatures. You live, you die, and nothing matters. A gasp escaped from the congregation. People began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, their faces twisted in confusion, fear, and disbelief. It was as if Anna's words were cutting through everything they had ever believed. She wasn't just questioning their faith, she was destroying it, one word at a time. The preacher's eyes filled with desperation. "Oh, you're wrong. You don't understand. God is love. God is all-powerful. He is the reason we exist." Anna's gaze softened ever so slightly, but her words came out even more forcefully. "No, John. He's not love. He's not power. He's just a force of nature. He doesn't interfere. He doesn't care. The afterlife is not a place of peace or reward. It's just an endless void." The room felt colder still. The sound of Anna's words seemed to echo louder than anything. The preacher staggered backward, shaking his head in disbelief, trying to deny it, but Anna's certainty was undeniable. She was no longer the innocent girl they had once known. She had become a harbinger of a truth too terrifying to accept. One of the townspeople, an elderly woman sitting near the front, stood up and spoke in a trembling voice. "But what about the good we do? What about the love we show one another? Does that not mean anything?" Anna turned to face her, her eyes unblinking, her expression still cold. "Love doesn't matter to God. It never has. It's just a human construct. Something you created to feel better about your existence. But when you die, it all fades away. You don't take it with you. You don't find eternal peace. You're just gone." The elderly woman sat back down, tears welling in her eyes, unable to speak. The room fell silent again, as if the weight of Anna's words had suffocated every ounce of hope in the church. No one knew how to respond. They had been given a glimpse of something far darker than they could have imagined. The preacher opened his mouth to speak again, but his words were cut off by Anna's voice, low and chilling. "You want to know the truth? The truth is, God doesn't exist as you've been told. He doesn't have a plan for you. There's no grand design. There's only an endless cycle of birth, suffering, and death. That's all." Her words were final, and the room felt like it was collapsing in on itself. The last shreds of hope, of faith, that had held this community together seemed to unravel in front of their eyes. It was a brutal, ugly truth, one they could never unhear. A few people in the back of the church began to whisper more loudly now, their voices filled with fear and anger. They couldn't handle this new reality that Anna had forced upon them. It was too much to bear. Some started to get up and leave, unable to stay in the church any longer, unable to face what had been said. But Anna didn't flinch. She wasn't there for their comfort or their acceptance. She had already seen the truth, and now it was their turn to face it, no matter how much it hurt. And as the turmoil continued to build, Anna stood at the front of the church, waiting for them to grasp the magnitude of what she had just revealed. For some, it would be too much to accept. But for others, perhaps there would be no turning back. The truth had been unleashed, and it could never be taken away. The atmosphere in the church was thick with tension, a mix of confusion, anger, and disbelief. The air felt heavy, as though each breath was being suffocated by the weight of Anna's words. The once peaceful sanctuary, filled with light and warmth, had transformed into a battleground for the very essence of their faith. The reality that Anna had forced upon them was too much to process, and the congregation, once united by their beliefs, was now deeply divided. The preacher, John, was still struggling to regain his composure, his hands trembling as he gripped the edges of the pulpit. His face, once full of the confidence that had made him a leader in the town, was now pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had never been challenged like this before, never faced a truth that so blatantly undermined everything he had built his life around. The certainty that had driven him to serve the Lord now felt like an anchor, dragging him down into a sea of doubt and confusion. "How can you say such things?" he asked, his voice shaking. "How can you claim that God doesn't care? That he doesn't love us?" His words were desperate, as if pleading with Anna to take back her harsh reality. "You were dead, Anna. You saw what happened after you left, and you're telling me that it's all a lie? That the God we've trusted all our lives is nothing more than an indifferent force?" Anna's gaze, cold and unwavering, met his with a sharpness that cut through his emotional outburst. She took a deep breath, as if gathering herself before speaking, but when she did, her voice was calm, almost matter-of-fact. "I'm not telling you anything," Anna said. "I'm showing you what I saw. I lived it. I died and I came back. The truth doesn't care if you believe it or not. It's just there. And the truth is that God, as you know him, does not exist. Not in the way you've been taught. Not in the way you've been promised." The words hung in the air like poison, sinking into the hearts of those who were still listening, those who hadn't yet run from the church in fear. The preacher's face contorted with pain, his eyes welling up with tears as he tried to wrap his mind around what was happening. This wasn't just a challenge to his authority. It wasn't just an assault on his teachings. This was a challenge to everything he had ever believed. "We've been good," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We've prayed. We've done everything we were supposed to do. We've followed God's commands. Why would he leave us like this? Why would he allow you to come back only to tell us this terrible truth?" Anna's expression softened for just a moment, but the sadness in her eyes was not for him. It was for everyone in the room who had built their lives on a lie they could no longer cling to. "Because he doesn't care," Anna said again, her voice steady. "You've been misled. All of you. And I'm sorry for that. But I can't take back what I've seen. I can't erase the truth. It's not about punishment or justice. It's just the way things are." Her words sent another ripple through the congregation, and the confusion and anger swelled once again. A murmur broke out among the townspeople, some speaking in hushed tones, others shaking their heads in disbelief. It was as though the very fabric of their lives was unraveling, and they didn't know how to stop it. One man, a middle-aged figure near the back of the room, stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger. "Enough," he shouted, his voice loud and defiant. "This is madness. You can't just come in here, say these things, and tear apart everything we've ever believed. You're just a confused girl, looking for attention. You don't know what you're talking about." Anna turned her head slowly to face him, her eyes piercing. "You're wrong," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the room with chilling calmness. "I know exactly what I'm talking about. And I'm not doing this for attention. I'm doing it because you need to hear it. All of you." The man's face reddened even more, and he took a few steps toward her, his fists clenched. "You think you know more than us? More than what we've been taught our whole lives? Who do you think you are, coming here and spouting this nonsense?" "I'm someone who saw the truth," Anna replied, her voice unwavering. "And now you will see it too." The preacher stepped forward, his face twisted with anguish and disbelief. "Anna, please," he begged, his voice breaking. "This isn't the way to do this. If you truly believe in what you're saying, you're tearing apart everything we stand for. Everything I've dedicated my life to." Anna's gaze softened for just a moment. She took a slow breath, as though she could feel the weight of the pain that had been inflicted on these people. But she didn't flinch. She didn't turn back. The truth was not something she could take back, not something she could bury again. "The truth isn't always kind," Anna said softly, "and sometimes it's too much to bear. But it's the only thing that's real. You've been living in a world of falsehoods, and now it's time for you to wake up." The silence that followed her words was deafening. No one moved. No one dared to speak. The tension in the room was so thick, it felt like it could suffocate them all. Finally, a soft sob broke the silence. Anna's mother, who had been silent up until this point, stood up shakily. Her face was streaked with tears, her voice filled with a mixture of grief and disbelief. "Anna, please? What are you saying? You're our daughter. You can't mean this. Please tell me you don't mean it." Anna's expression softened again, but this time it wasn't with the cold, detached certainty that had characterized her words so far. There was a deep sadness in her eyes, a sorrow that she could not hide. She turned to face her mother, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry, but I have to tell you the truth. I saw it. And it's too late to change it." Her words hit like a blow, and the room fell silent once more. The truth, the terrible, cold truth, was out there, and now there was no going back. The tension in the church reached a boiling point, the air crackling with unease. The townspeople had begun to break into heated arguments, their voices growing louder and more frantic. The preacher's face was flushed with anger, his once calm demeanor shattered by Anna's unrelenting truth. The congregation was divided now. Some were still clinging to the idea that Anna was somehow wrong, that she was just a confused child, while others were beginning to question everything they had ever believed. "Enough of this," shouted one of the men near the back, his voice thick with frustration. "You're not some divine messenger. You're just a girl who doesn't understand what she's talking about." He took a few steps forward, pointing his finger at Anna. "You can't just come in here and tear apart everything we've worked for, everything we've built our lives on." Anna's gaze was steady as ever, unblinking, unmoved by his fury. "I'm not tearing anything apart," she said calmly. "I'm revealing the truth. The truth you've been avoiding, refusing to see." "You call this the truth?" another voice cried out. It was a woman, her face pale with shock and disbelief. "How can you say such things about God? About the afterlife? You've been dead. You can't know what you're talking about." Anna's expression softened for a brief moment, but the intensity of her words didn't change. "I don't need to be alive to know the truth," she said, her voice now filled with an eerie quietness. "I've seen it with my own eyes. I've been to the place you all dream of, and it's not what you think it is. It's not a paradise. It's not a place of peace or reward. It's a place of silence and nothingness." The woman recoiled as if struck, her hand trembling as she wiped at her eyes. The other townspeople began to murmur again, their voices a mixture of fear, doubt, and confusion. Anna's words were like a wound, raw, and unhealable. They had come to this church seeking solace, to witness a miracle, to hear that Anna's return was a sign of God's favor, but instead, they had been confronted with the most terrifying possibility imaginable, that their entire faith might be a lie. The preacher, who had been trying to regain his composure, now turned to the crowd. His voice was sharp, his eyes wild with desperation. "We cannot allow this blasphemy to continue. This is not the message we have been taught. This is not what God intends. Anna, you've been through something terrible, something no one should have to endure, but this is not you. This is the grief speaking. It's your pain talking. You are in no position to teach us about the afterlife." Anna's eyes narrowed, her gaze never leaving his. "You think I don't understand? You think I don't know what I'm saying?" she asked, her voice growing colder with each word. "I saw everything, John. I saw what happens when we die, and it isn't what you've been telling people. It's not a reward, it's not a judgment, it's just the end. You disappear. That's it. There's no heaven. There's no hell. There's just darkness." The preacher's jaw clenched, his fists tight at his sides. He had never been challenged like this before. His whole life had been built on the idea that God was watching, that there was a purpose behind everything, that there was an afterlife full of peace and rewards for the faithful. Now, everything he had known was crumbling, and he couldn't accept it. He couldn't allow it. "You are deluded," he shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "You are grieving and lost, and you've let your pain twist your mind. This isn't the truth, Anna. This is madness. You're condemning us all with your lies." But Anna didn't flinch. She stood tall, her posture unwavering, as if the entire world could be crumbling around her, and it wouldn't matter. "Maybe it's not a lie," she replied, her voice eerily calm. "Maybe the lie is what you've been teaching all these years. You've lied to yourself, John, and you've lied to all these people. You've been telling them there's a reason for everything, that there's a plan, but there isn't. The truth is, everything ends, and it ends in silence." The preacher took a step back, his chest heaving with the weight of her words. It was like a hammer striking his very soul, driving him to the edge of collapse. He had always been the one in control. He had been the one who spoke with authority, who held the trust of the community in his hands. But now, all that control was slipping away, and the terrifying possibility of Anna's truth was unraveling everything he had built. One of the elderly women sitting near the front of the church stood up, her voice trembling with emotion. "This can't be true," she said, her hand clutching her heart. "I've spent my entire life believing that God was good, that he had a plan for me. You're telling me that all of that was for nothing?" Anna's eyes softened slightly, but there was no warmth in them, no compassion. "I'm not telling you it was for nothing," she said quietly. "I'm just telling you that it wasn't what you think it is. I'm not here to take away your faith, I'm just showing you the truth. God doesn't have a plan for you. You are just here and then you're gone. There is no purpose, no grand design, just nothing. The woman collapsed back into her seat, her body shaking with grief, and several others began to murmur, their voices tinged with fear. The preacher's face was pale now, his eyes wide as he turned to the congregation. "Don't listen to her," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "She's not herself. She's been corrupted, led astray by the forces of darkness. Don't listen to her lies. Our faith, our God, our hope, this is what we have. We cannot let it go." But the damage had been done. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and the truth that Anna spoke continued to hang in the air like an oppressive cloud, suffocating the very hope the town had clung to for so long. The preacher's words, once so confident and sure, now felt hollow, as if the foundation of everything he had believed in had been shattered beyond repair. And still, Anna remained standing at the front, unyielding, her expression unchanged, as the room around her began to crumble, both physically and emotionally. The atmosphere in the church had shifted completely. What was once a place of worship, a sanctuary for solace and peace, had now become a battleground of belief. The weight of Anna's words pressed down on everyone, suffocating them in a way that was impossible to ignore. The murmurs of disbelief were growing louder, and panic was beginning to spread. The congregation, which had once been united in their faith, was now torn apart by the very truth Anna had revealed. The preacher, John, stood at the front, his face pale and drenched with sweat, his hands trembling as he clutched the Bible in front of him. His entire life had been built on the foundation of faith, on the certainty that God was real and that there was a purpose to every life. But now, everything he had ever preached, everything he had devoted himself to, was collapsing. He didn't know how to fight back against Anna's words, against the truth she was delivering. The world he had known was gone, and in its place was a terrifying emptiness. "Anna," John said, his voice faltering but laced with desperation. "You don't understand. This isn't you speaking. This is the pain. This is the grief from your death. It's clouding your mind. You need to stop right now. You're causing people to question their very souls." Anna didn't flinch at his words. She simply looked at him, her gaze unwavering, as though she could see straight through him. "I'm not confused, John. I've seen the truth. And so have you. You've just been too afraid to admit it." The preacher's hands shook more violently now, the Bible slipping from his grip as he clenched his fists. "I don't know what happened to you, but I know what I've been taught. I know what I've learned in my life. God is love. God is mercy. God is good." Anna shook her head slowly, almost pityingly. "You've been told that, John. But you don't know it. You've never known it. God is none of those things. He doesn't care about you, or your prayers, or your faith. He doesn't love you. He's indifferent. And that's the truth." Her voice rang with a chilling finality. Behind Anna, her parents were seated, their faces etched with confusion, grief, and something deeper, guilt. Her father's hands were clasped tightly in his lap, knuckles white, as though he was desperately trying to hold onto something, anything, that might make sense of this. He had lost his daughter once, and now, it felt like he was losing her again. His heart ached, but not for the reasons one might expect. It wasn't just the grief of losing his child that hurt, it was the deep, terrifying truth she was revealing. "Anna, please," her mother whispered, her voice breaking. "You're scaring us. Please, you have to stop this. It's not you. It's the trauma. Please, baby, you have to come back to us." But Anna remained unmoved, her gaze distant as she stared at the preacher. "This is me," she said softly. "I'm not coming back. I can't go back to the way things were. I've seen too much." The preacher's face twisted with anger and fear. He stepped closer to her, his voice now rising in volume. "You think you know the truth? You think you've seen the afterlife, the way things really are? You're just a scared little girl who doesn't understand what's happening to her. You can't know what's beyond this life." Anna's eyes flashed, a sharp, cold gleam in them. "You're wrong," she said, her voice growing colder with each word. "I've seen it. I've been there. I've seen the nothingness, the void that waits for all of you. And I'm here to tell you that your faith has been a lie. The congregation was now fully divided. Some were beginning to cry, others were shaking their heads, as though trying to block out the truth that Anna had delivered. The preacher's face was red with fury, his hands balled into fists at his sides. He stepped forward, his voice trembling with emotion. "I won't let you destroy this church," he spat, his words filled with venom. "I won't let you tear apart everything we've built. You're not a prophet, Anna. You're not speaking the truth. You're just a girl who's been lost. And I won't allow you to drag everyone down with you." Anna didn't flinch. She didn't flinch when he raised his hand, or when he moved closer, the air crackling with the tension between them. Her face remained impassive, her gaze unwavering, as though she were a witness to the unfolding storm but not part of it. It was as though she were already somewhere else, beyond this world, beyond the people standing before her. "You can't stop it," Anna said, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. "The truth is already out. You can't erase it. You can't pretend it didn't happen. There's no going back from this." The preacher's body shook with anger, but there was something else in his eyes now: fear. A deep, primal fear. He knew Anna wasn't lying. He could see it in her eyes. He could feel it in the way the room had grown colder, the way everything seemed to shift, as though the very walls of the church were closing in on them. You can't just walk in here and destroy everything we believe in," he stammered, but the words lacked conviction. The truth had already begun to break through the walls he had built up over the years. It was undeniable. The silence that followed was deafening. The congregation was frozen in place, no one daring to speak, their collective breath held in anticipation. It was as though they were waiting for something, anything, to break the tension. But nothing came. Anna stood in the center of the room, her presence like a dark shadow hanging over them all. Her eyes, cold and unblinking, scanned the congregation one last time. "You've been told the truth," she said, her voice echoing in the silence. "And now you'll have to live with it?" The preacher took a step back, his chest heaving with emotion. The room felt heavier now, the truth of what Anna had revealed settling on everyone's shoulders like a weight they could no longer escape. He had always believed in a higher purpose, in a greater meaning behind everything. But now that foundation had cracked, and he was left to face the unbearable reality that everything he had built his life on was a lie. Anna turned her back on him, her expression still unchanged, as the room behind her seemed to fall into chaos. The room was now an uneasy cacophony of gasps, murmurs, and raised voices. The once tight-knit congregation was breaking apart under the weight of Anna's revelation. People who had come to the church seeking comfort and certainty were now left questioning everything they had held dear. The preacher's authority had been shattered in a way he had never experienced, and the fear in his eyes was now palpable. It wasn't just the fear of losing control. It was the fear of realizing that everything he had preached, everything he had spent his life building, was now a lie. Anna stood motionless in the center of the room, her eyes scanning the crowd with an unsettling calmness. Her face remained expressionless, but inside, she could feel the storm brewing in the church around her. She knew what had to happen next. She knew that once the truth was out, there was no turning back. She wasn't here to comfort anyone, to offer them peace or solace. She was here to make them face the unbearable truth. And now, she could see the cracks in their faith deepening. "Do you hear yourselves?" a woman's voice cried out from the back. "This isn't right. You're tearing apart everything we've ever believed in. You're going to bring us all to ruin." Her words were punctuated by a chorus of similar sentiments from the crowd, but Anna didn't flinch. "You're already ruined," she said, her voice soft yet filled with a chilling finality. "You just don't know it yet?" The preacher, his face ashen, raised his hands in an attempt to regain control of the situation. He was trembling now, and his voice was barely more than a whisper. "Please, Anna, this isn't you. You're confused. You were dead. You didn't understand what you saw. This is not the truth." But Anna turned to face him again, her eyes burning with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "The truth is exactly what I saw. The truth is that there is no salvation, no divine plan. There is only darkness. There is only the void. God isn't here. He's never been here. The preacher's knees buckled slightly as if the weight of her words had struck him physically. The doubt that had been gnawing at him, the fear that maybe, just maybe, Anna was right, began to take root. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure anymore. The walls he had built around himself, the security of his beliefs, had cracked open, and in their place was a growing, terrifying emptiness. He raised his hand, trying to maintain authority, but his voice wavered. "This is blasphemy, Anna. You are testing the very foundation of our lives. How can you say such things and not understand the damage you're causing? You're putting us all in peril." Anna stepped toward him, the weight of her words settling heavily in the room. "I'm not the one putting you in peril, John. You've been living a lie for years, and now it's all coming apart. You've spent your life convincing yourself that God is real, that there's meaning in everything, but there's no meaning. There's nothing. There's only what you've been told, and none of it's true." Behind her, the congregation was no longer speaking. They were too stunned to react, too afraid to confront the truth she was laying bare. Some had begun to cry, clutching their loved ones, while others were paralyzed by the weight of what she had said. Their faith was crumbling, and with it, the security they had once found in the walls of this church. The room had become a place of judgment, a place where their deepest beliefs were being stripped away. Anna turned away from the preacher, her eyes now scanning the frightened faces of the townspeople. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice soft, almost regretful. "Now that you know the truth? What do you do with it?" The preacher, still holding on to whatever shred of authority he had left, tried once more to regain control. "We have to pray," he muttered desperately. "We have to pray for guidance. We need to remember that God is good, that He is merciful." But Anna didn't even look at him this time. "You can pray all you want, but it won't change anything," she said, her voice steady. "You can beg for answers, but none will come. There's no divine intervention. No one is listening." A young man near the front, his hands clenched tightly into fists, stood up suddenly, shouting, "This isn't right. You're just trying to make us question everything we've ever believed. You can't just walk in here and say these things." Anna didn't move, didn't even flinch at his outburst. "What's wrong with questioning?" she asked quietly. "What's wrong with wanting to know the truth?" The man froze, his anger dissipating as the weight of her words sank in. Around the room, other townspeople began to look at each other with unease. Some had tears in their eyes, some were trembling, but all were processing what had been said. A few tried to speak, but their words caught in their throats. The preacher finally dropped his hands, a look of defeat crossing his face. He had no more words left. His foundation had been shaken beyond repair, and he knew it. He couldn't deny it any longer. Anna's truth had broken through, and there was nothing left for him to say. The silence that followed was deafening. No one knew what to do next. The church, once a place of refuge and hope, had become a tomb of lost faith. And standing in the center of it all, Anna waited. She had delivered her message, and now it was up to them to accept it or be swallowed by it. But there was one thing Anna knew for certain: no one would leave this place the same. The truth had been spoken, and the consequences were inevitable. The silence in the room was almost unbearable. The tension hung in the air like a heavy cloud, weighing down on everyone present. Anna stood still in the center of the church, her eyes scanning the congregation, her face unreadable. She had said what she needed to say, and now there was nothing more. The truth was out. What the townspeople did with it, how they processed it, was no longer her concern. But the preacher, John, was still reeling from the shock of what had just transpired. He had spent years building a life around his faith, teaching the people in his care about a loving, merciful God. And now, all of that was crumbling in front of him. Everything he believed, everything he had ever known, was suddenly irrelevant. The very foundation of his existence was being torn apart. He took a few shaky steps forward, his hand gripping the edge of the pulpit as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. His eyes were wild, his breath ragged, as though he was trying to make sense of something that simply didn't make sense. "No," he muttered, barely audible. "No, this can't be right. Anna, this can't be true." Anna's voice cut through the air, clear and cold. "It's the only truth there is, John. I've seen it with my own eyes. There's nothing after this. There's no grand plan. There's no salvation. The preacher's head snapped up, and he glared at her, his face twisted in fury. You are a liar. You don't know what you're talking about. You're just a child, a confused little girl. You were dead, Anna. You were gone. You can't just come back and turn everything upside down. Anna didn't flinch. Her gaze remained steady, unwavering. I'm not lying. I'm not confused. I've seen what happens. It's just nothing. There is no God, no heaven, no hell. There's just darkness. The end. The preacher took another step toward her, but his anger seemed to waver, replaced by something else: fear. Fear not just for himself, but for everyone in the room. The people in the congregation were looking at him now, their eyes filled with uncertainty and doubt. They had come seeking answers, and instead, they had been given a terrifying truth that they weren't sure how to process. One of the elders, a woman in her 60s, stood up slowly from her seat. Her hands trembled as she gripped the back of the pew in front of her. No, she whispered, her voice breaking. No, Anna. This can't be true. We've been taught our whole lives to believe in God's love, in His mercy. How can you stand there and say that He doesn't care? That we mean nothing? Anna's eyes softened, but there was no sympathy in them. I'm sorry. I didn't want to hurt you, but I can't lie. I can't pretend that what I saw isn't the truth. The elderly woman's knees buckled, and she collapsed back into her seat, her hands pressed to her face as she wept. The people around her murmured in shock, some in disbelief, others on the verge of breaking down themselves. There was no way to reconcile Anna's words with the world they had known. Their faith, their whole lives, seemed to have been built on a fragile foundation that was now shattered beyond repair. The preacher, his fists clenched at his sides, took a deep, shuddering breath. He couldn't accept it. He couldn't let go of the belief that God had a purpose for all of them, that there was a reason for their suffering, for their lives. But Anna's truth was undeniable. It rang through the church like a death knell, louder and more persistent with each passing second. He turned to face the congregation, his voice hoarse and pleading. Don't listen to her. Don't let her take away everything we've built, everything we've believed. God is real. God is love. He is merciful. We've prayed for miracles and Anna's return. This is a miracle. This is God's will. But the room was no longer listening. The people were lost in their own thoughts, their minds spinning as they tried to comprehend what Anna had said. Some whispered to each other, trying to make sense of it, while others simply sat in stunned silence. The air in the church was thick with confusion, fear, and grief. They had come here hoping for solace, for a sign from God that everything would be okay. But instead, they had been confronted with the terrifying possibility that nothing they believed was real. Anna watched them with a detached calmness. She didn't feel pity for them, nor did she feel anything else. She had seen the truth, and she knew that this was the only way for them to understand it. They had to face it just as she had. There was no turning back from it. I'm not here to make you feel bad, Anna said, her voice quiet but filled with a strange authority. I'm not here to destroy you. I'm just telling you what I saw. You can choose to ignore it, to pretend it didn't happen, but that won't change what's real. The truth is, God doesn't care. He never did. Her words struck the congregation like a physical blow, and many of them recoiled, as if she had just slapped them across the face. But Anna didn't look away. She didn't falter. The truth was too important, and now that it was out, she couldn't hold it back. A young man, barely in his 20s, stood up from the back of the room, his face flushed with anger. You're wrong, he shouted, his voice filled with fury. You're just a kid. You don't know anything about God. You can't just come in here and say that no one's gonna listen to you. Anna turned slowly to face him, her eyes unblinking, her expression cold and unwavering. You'll listen, she said simply. You'll all listen because deep down, you know I'm right. The young man stepped forward, his fists clenched, but his body stiffened as Anna's words hit him like a wave of realization. He opened his mouth to speak again, but no words came out. The truth was sinking in, and he was beginning to understand. They all were. The preacher, now nearly beside himself, collapsed onto his knees. His hands trembled as he clutched the Bible to his chest, his face a mask of desperation. "Please, Anna," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Please, tell me this isn't true. Tell me you're lying. Tell me it's all a test, that it's just a bad dream." But Anna only shook her head slowly, her gaze steady. "I'm not lying, John. And it's not a dream. It's the truth." The church had fallen silent again. The weight of Anna's words had crushed whatever hope remained. People were now standing up and leaving, their eyes wide with fear, with tears streaming down their faces. Others remained seated, unsure of what to do, their minds too stunned to move. The preacher remained kneeling at the pulpit, his body shaking with the weight of everything he had just learned. Anna watched them all, her heart heavy, but her resolve unshaken. She had done what she came to do. The truth was out, and now it was up to them to live with it. And as the last of the townspeople filed out of the church, leaving behind only a few stragglers, Anna stood alone. The church, once filled with hope and faith, now felt like a tomb. The echoes of her words reverberated through the empty space, leaving behind only silence.